It's a great pleasure and honor to be with you all. What can I say? This has been perhaps the strangest election year, well, certainly the strangest election year of my memory, and one of the strangest on record. 2 years ago, year and a half ago, when I was giving speeches, people would say, "Oh, who's the Republican nominee going to be?" And I would say, "Well, there's a million people running. I have no idea. But the one person it's not going to be is Donald Trump." And everyone would laugh. Ha, ha, ha. I changed that about 8 months ago, stopped using that joke, because it became very clear that he was in a very strong position, or an increasingly strong position to win the nomination. And after last night, he is really very likely to be the Republican nominee for president. He will talk more about it and obviously answer questions, but his route to this point has been certainly unusual in the extreme. He's done it, interestingly enough, without spending a lot of money, at least in terms of American elections. Everybody thought when he first got in, oh, he's a billionaire, he's going to buy the election. He spent about $26 million. Now, to you and me, that may sound like a lot of money. It's not, by the standards of American elections. That's what Carly Fiorina spent on her campaign. She never even got started. She spent $26 million. Scott Walker, the governor of Wisconsin, who dropped out before any votes were cast, spent $40 million on his campaign. Jeb Bush spent well over $100 million, got nowhere with it. Ted Cruz spent over $100 million. So the truth is, Donald Trump has been one of the lowest spenders, not the big spender. And people said, oh, it's a big mistake. He's, too tight. He should be spending more of his money. He's doing okay. On the Democratic side, it's obvious, I think, at this point that Hillary Clinton is in an even stronger position, I would say, than Donald Trump to win the Democratic nomination. But let me roll back a little bit and describe some of the context for this. As you all know, our primary system in the U.S. Is unique in that it is serial. That is, you have some states that are early, some states that are late. The Constitution or state law of New Hampshire is that it has to be the first primary by law. So if somebody were to move their primary to January of the election year, they'd move their primary to December of the year before. And if somebody moved it to December of the year before, they'd be in, God knows they could be 3 years in advance potentially. But the law requires that they be the first primary. Their state law requires that they be the first primary. And Iowa, of course, is the first contest. It's a caucus, a little bit different than the primary, but for all intents and purposes, the same thing. And the fundamental reality is, though what happens in those early contests influences what happens later, after those early contests. In fact, only once since we went to the system of using primaries and caucuses, only once has anyone in either party gotten the nomination without winning either Iowa or New Hampshire. It was Bill Clinton in 1992, had some unusual circumstances, but by and large, you have to win Iowa or New Hampshire to get the nomination. Why is that? Well, the answer is pretty simple. George Bush, the father, talked about the big mo that he got out of winning New Hampshire. Well, behind that big mo momentum are the two V's, viability and visibility. Visibility, over half of the coverage, of the news coverage of the entire primary process comes out of Iowa and New Hampshire. So that is a huge lift that people get. If they win one of those contests, it's a huge lift. And if you don't win, you can't really catch up because so much of the coverage is coming out of those two states. Second, the tone of the coverage tends to be rather positive if you're the winner. What a great thing they did. What a great job. How amazing they won. The tone tends to be quite negative if you lose those early contests. The question that the interviewers are asking is, when are you quitting the race? When are you getting out? When are you firing your campaign manager? What changes are you making? Because you obviously have no traction with the public. It's really a terrible point in a campaign because that's really the kind of questions you're being asked. And it's really hard to deliver a positive, upbeat message to people when the questions are all of that kind. So visibility, very important, and the kind of visibility that you get out of winning one of those contests. And the second is viability. That is, people tend to want to vote for someone who they think has some reasonable chance of winning. Nothing proves you can win like winning. And so when people look at someone who won Iowa or won New Hampshire, they say, you know what? There's someone who actually can win. And so you have poor Marco Rubio. I think we call him Little Marco now, as Donald Trump does. But Marco Rubio was not able to win either of those contests. He won his first last night. It was a caucus in Minnesota. I don't think he even expected to win that. I'm not sure. I haven't been able to check this yet, but I'm not sure he ever even visited Minnesota as part of that campaign. And it's a caucus, small group of people. But the bottom line is that's all he was able to put together. He may lose his own state. Ted Cruz actually had 2 victories last night, including his own state. And that's in part because he won Iowa. Donald Trump obviously won in New Hampshire and has gone on to win since then. But you can see at that early point that if you're going to win Iowa, or you need to win Iowa or New Hampshire, a strategy that doesn't include winning one of those 2 states is a strategy that is almost destined to fail. Marco Rubio's strategy was to lose his way to the nomination. That's obviously been set back by winning in this surprising victory in Minnesota. So he probably is now going to have to figure out something else to do. But in any event, very difficult to break through if you haven't won one of those 2 contests. On the Democratic side, there are obviously only 2 real candidates running, and they split them. Hillary Clinton won in Iowa, Bernie Sanders in New Hampshire. Let me go back to the Republican race, though, and because it's at this point the more interesting one, I think. Talk a little bit about how Trump has been able to do this and with spending so little money, and then we'll talk a little about the Democrats, and then a few words on the general election. Many people have called Trump the first social media candidate. Again, he spent less on the usual accoutrements of campaigning. And I will tell you, one of the most expensive things in any campaign is what we call keeping the plane in the air. You got to be flying from place to place. He has his own very large plane, and it's very expensive to keep that in the air. He had almost no television ads of any kind. He spent a lot of his money on keeping his plane in the air. And so what did he do to get his message across? Well, basically, he tweeted 10 times a day. He has 6.5 million Twitter followers. 6.5 million Twitter followers. He tweets at least 10 times a day. At least 10 times. There was one day where he tweeted 51 times in one day. In the last week, he had about 448 million likes or mentions on Facebook. Okay? What does he do? He gets up every morning and says, what is the most outrageous thing I can say today that will get people talking? And he tweets it out or something, a version of it, or tries different things in those 10, 12, 50 tweets. And it starts a huge storm of interest on Twitter and on Facebook. All of a sudden, everybody's talking about it. Last week, 448 million people at least on Facebook alone were talking about it. All the reporters monitor those sites, Twitter, Facebook. They see that there's a huge storm kicked up on those websites, and they say, well, this has got to be the story of the day. Everybody's focused on what Donald Trump said about the Pope, what Donald Trump said about Muslims, what Donald Trump said about Mexicans, what he said about building a wall and making the Mexicans pay for it. Whatever it is on that day, he's been able to dominate the coverage. So he dominates the social media, and that in turn has caused the mainstream media, if you will, to focus their attention on him incessantly. And so he has gotten vastly more coverage than anybody else. He did before Iowa and New Hampshire. It only accelerated after New Hampshire and is accelerating beyond all proportions as we sit here this morning. So he's really run his campaign as a social media event. It is unique, though. One of the things that happens in politics is politicians sit around and say, and try and imitate others. In our industry, like anecdote passes for evidence by and large. So people say, well, Trump did it. Why can't I do what Trump did? But there's a lot of reasons other people can't do what Trump did. Marco Rubio tried by accusing Trump of wetting his pants during a debate and having a relatively small penis. That was his attempt to get into the discussion. It didn't work as well for him as it did for Trump, because you have to have a certain kind of personality to carry that off. The truth is, Donald Trump also had hundreds of millions of dollars worth of publicity from a television show that was on for many years in the United States. People watched it. I never did, but believe me, lots of people watched it. They knew who he was. He'd written books that were popular. So if you didn't have that going for you, you wouldn't be able to use that strategy. If he was an accountant from Ocala, Florida, instead of a billionaire from Manhattan, it wouldn't have worked either. If he was running for any other office in the country other than president, it also wouldn't have worked because nobody would have cared very much. He wouldn't have kicked up that kind of storm on Twitter or elsewhere day after day after day. So the reality is it's a unique campaign. It's not one that people are going to be able to imitate very easily. You also, as I say, have to have the personality for it. Marco Rubio doesn't have the personality for it. It looks very inauthentic when he does it. Donald Trump is nuts, and so when he acts that way, it seems very authentic. He's been able to appeal to people on a number of different levels. His audience or his constituents really has three core elements. One is, I'll label simply the smallest, but it is the haters. There are people who hate Muslims, hate Mexicans, hate Jews, whoever. They're with him. Strange bedfellows, Louis Farrakhan yesterday endorsed Trump on the basis of his anti-Semitic comment. So there you go. You can see how strange things happen. But in any event, that's just a relatively small group of his constituency, but people who really are the haters. There's a second group that are focused on his business accomplishments. And they look at that in a couple of different ways. One is to say, if he did it for himself, he can do it for me and for the country. He made himself a billionaire, maybe he can get me a $10,000 raise or a $5,000 raise somehow. So there's that element of being able to lift himself up to high financial heights, and then be able to do that for the country as well. There's also, as a result of his wealth, a sense that he's not bought by anybody. He's funding his own campaign. He's not part of the campaign finance system, and people find that attractive as well. So there's people that are attracted by his wealth and his money. And finally, the largest group of people are folks who believe, Republicans who believe, that their leadership has betrayed them in Washington, D.C., and that is the word that they use. And indeed, in the exit polls, over half of Republicans have said that they believe their leadership has betrayed them. And what that means is, from their point of view, they elected a majority of Republicans in the House and the Senate. They sent those people there to do things, repeal Obamacare, stop Obama from appointing any judges, all kinds of things that in their minds were very important policy objectives. And again, from their perspective, their leaders gave in. They rolled over. They let Obama win. Now, never mind the fact that he was the president, is the president. That gives you certain powers. That you have to have 60 votes in the Senate to change things. Okay, never mind. They don't really understand that. What they say is, we sent these guys to Washington. They rolled over, and they betrayed us, the people, me, the people who voted for him. Not me personally, for sure, but the people that did vote for them. So that and that sentiment is very strong in the Republican Party, and it helps to fuel Trump, because what people say about Donald Trump is he has a backbone of steel. Every time he says something outrageous, people criticize him, and he does not equivocate. He does not back down. He does not shade his views. Rather, he doubles down. And because he doubles down instead of backing down, people say, there is a guy who has a backbone of steel. This guy will not be pushed around by the people in Washington, by the Democrats in Washington. He'll get what he wants, he'll do what he wants, and he's not going to change his mind because somebody criticized him. So, in fact, each of these episodes that the press and others speculated might destroy him actually made him stronger, to paraphrase Nietzsche. And so the reality is, the sense of him is that he is this strong backbone, won't be pushed around, and that's a very, very appealing attribute for people who think their party leadership has betrayed them. Again, they'll argue about his positions and so on, whether they're really Republican positions, but that's sort of beside the point. The point for these folks is he's going to do what he says he's going to do, and he's not going to be pushed around by the system. So that's a very strong element of his appeal. But really, all three of those constituencies are what he's drawing on. And I would say all of these people, as well as some of the people on the Democratic side, really feel that they are, to some extent, victims of globalization, victims of forces beyond their control. Indeed, if you look at the demography of his supporters, they are overwhelmingly not college educated. Well, what does that mean? That really means, obviously it means they didn't graduate from college, but beyond that, it means that they are buffeted to a much greater extent by the economic winds than our college-educated people. It means that they don't understand as clearly what's happening to them and why it's happening as people who have a college education. So these are people who feel that they are losing, that they're lost economically, culturally, all kinds of different ways, and they resent it. And they're angry about it. And that, again, fuels all of those groups to some extent or other in the Trump constituency and, to some extent, the Sanders constituency. Let me turn to the Democrats now for a moment. Hillary Clinton started out as the prohibitive favorite. Bernie Sanders, by coming very close in Iowa and winning New Hampshire, became a serious candidate, at least for a time. The possibility of his winning was on the table. The truth is he was never very likely to win, both because of the appeal that Hillary Clinton has, the very broad and deep appeal that she has in the Democratic Party, but also because his constituency, that is Sanders' constituency, was limited to a relatively small segment of the Democratic vote. He was getting 80%, add all the primaries together, almost 2/3 of the vote under 30. People under 30 overwhelmingly voting for Trump. They didn't have the same... Sanders, thank you, Sanders. Didn't have the connection with Clinton that older voters had, saw Hillary Clinton as less authentic, saw him as more authentic, the whole hair, the Brooklyn, everything else, sort of worked to make him a real person as far as they were concerned, who was addressing an issue of importance to Democratic voters, income inequality, again, in a very clear, direct way, not equivocating, not shading, saying very clearly what he thought. So, but he only really appealed to those young white voters. There are enough young white voters to win places like New Hampshire if you do well enough with others. There's enough young white voters in the Iowa caucuses to do well. He almost won, but he didn't. But there are not enough young white voters among Democratic voters as a whole across the country to win the nomination. And he's never really been able to expand his appeal very much beyond that group. And that's been his problem all the way along. The other problem he had is, given where he was starting from, given where Hillary Clinton was starting from, he really had to win Iowa to put himself, to get the level of momentum, to get the level of visibility and viability that he needed to break through against somebody who was so well known, so popular, and had such a strong hold on the Democratic Party. If he had won Iowa, he may still not have won the nomination, but he would have been in a much better position to do it. And we saw last night the noose, if you will, start to close around Sanders. He did not do well with those constituents other than young white voters, and so he was able to win in a few states, including his own, not surprisingly. But in the big states with large numbers of delegates, he did not do well, even in Massachusetts, which obviously in New England, a neighbor of his, they had hoped to win. Hillary Clinton barely won, but winning is what matters in this game. And so that's really a problem for Sanders moving on. He may win some other contests along the way, but at the same time, he's very unlikely to win enough to make a major impact to deny Hillary Clinton the nomination. So we likely, not certain, but likely end up with these two candidates, Trump and Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, run against each other in the general election. Think about this. This will be the first time that we know of, first time since we've had polling, that we will have two candidates running for president, both of whom are disliked by a majority of the American people. Both of whom are disliked by a majority of the American people. Never happened before. You hear people talk all the time about the lesser of two evils, but in this case, they actually dislike both of them. And this is really a unique phenomenon. But again, important as we think about the general election to understand the structural dynamics. First, longevity matters. That is to say, only once since World War II has a party been elected for a third party term. That was George Bush's first term, following 2 terms of Ronald Reagan. So 2 Republican terms of Reagan, 1 of Bush. That's the only time that anybody's been elected to a third party term. It's a difficult thing to do. That's what Hillary Clinton is trying to do, get elected to a third party term. The second factor that counts against her to some extent is the fact that so many people don't like her. As I said, that doesn't necessarily put her at a disadvantage relative to Trump, but it does matter to some extent. We have an economy that is not great, could lapse back into recession. If it does, very problematic for Clinton. If it doesn't, better for her. But all this augurs for in the normal course of events, a very close race. You have a country that's pretty evenly divided. All those things are the case. So you would expect a close general election. Many people are saying that, well, of course, she's going to romp over Trump, and that is possible. But I would not count on it. I would still count on a close general election. Trump certainly has alienated a lot of constituencies, but Republicans have done that before. Latinos were not voting for Republicans in the past for president. African Americans were not voting for Republicans in the past. So the people that he's alienated, by and large, are people that would not really be voting for him anyway. However, one huge problem that he has, and that is holding the Republican Party together. Because of the outrageous nature of many of his comments, there are many Republicans who won't vote for him, I think, and many Republican leaders, more importantly, in the first instance, who will not endorse him. We've already seen some of them, a few of them, step forward and say that they will not vote for Trump under any circumstances. It will be interesting to see how that develops. Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader in the Senate, has basically told his vulnerable members, to be sure, and others as well, and his candidates, that they should disavow Trump, they should disown him, they should distance themselves from him. Some governors have already chosen to do that. Ben Sasse, a senator from Nebraska, Republican senator, has already said he won't support Trump under any circumstances. Everyone is now going to be asked the question. Every Republican office holder and every Republican candidate is going to be asked the question, and they're going to have to answer it in some way or other. We've never seen that kind of, I shouldn't say never, we've rarely seen that kind of disaffection in the party, in either party. The last time we came close to it was with George McGovern in 1972, but you still did not have major Democratic figures publicly announcing that they weren't going to vote for him. So this is a major fissure in the Republican Party. It's not, I think it won't destroy the Republican Party over the long term. They'll sort of move around this Trump phenomenon. But the reality is that Republicans in Congress, Republican governors, see Donald Trump as an existential threat. They believe that he will bring their party down, and he may well. So we don't know, and that in turn has an impact on voters. Voters look to leaders on all kinds of things. Even their positions on issues are often derived from what their partisan leaders tell them. And if some of their leaders are saying to them, I'm not voting for Donald Trump, maybe you shouldn't either, that could well have an effect on voters. Maybe they'll vote for Hillary Clinton. Maybe they will end up staying home. Either way, it will be a benefit to the Democrats. But as a Democrat, that's a positive development from my point of view, but I'm not counting on it. One has to go into this election assuming it's going to be a tough, competitive, and close race because Donald Trump is a unique figure, and he's going to come at Hillary Clinton in ways that she's never been come at before. And she is not good under pressure. Her body language is horrific most of the time. When she's under that kind of pressure, 2 huge exceptions. Her performance at the House hearing on Benghazi was fantastic. Her performance in the first debate was fantastic. But oftentimes when she's under that kind of pressure, she doesn't come across very well to people. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens. It will be a very unique election without a doubt. But let me stop there and see what questions folks have. Nimrod, just go ahead.
Do you remember that one?
That was even before the Eisenhower administration.
I know you about this. No, but seriously, the split.
It was Roosevelt?
Yeah,
About the split.
right, but it really split.
The third candidate.
Yes.
I'm asking, is the third candidate 1912 scenario or just the third?
Right. Well, so it really split in 1912. I don't think, I could be wrong, but I don't think it's going to really split. And I'm not sure there'll be a third candidate because it's very hard to organize that. It's very hard to put it together. It is absolutely clear that if there is a third candidate, there's no way the Republicans will win. So I'm not sure they want to do that to themselves. They're more worried. They were more worried about Donald Trump being a third-party candidate. So I don't think it's going to happen, but it is possible. It's the first time it's really possible since then. Yeah.
This year, all three branches could very well be in play. Could you comment on how the presidential election is going to impact on Congress and also vice versa?
Sure. Well, it's more the former than the latter. There's less vice versa. So the presidential election will have an impact on the congressional elections. First of all, this whole issue of Donald Trump will be an issue in the congressional elections. As I said, every Senate candidate, every senator, every House candidate, every member of the House, everybody running from mayor to dog catcher is going to be asked whether they're supporting Donald Trump or not. And there are some people in my party who believe that that's going to be sufficient to do in a lot of those folks. There are a lot of Republicans who believe that that's going to be sufficient to do them in, and they're very worried about that. And they're worried, as I suggested before, about the turnout. Even if those people don't end up voting for Democrats, just not voting at all would also damage them. So there is a threat that a Trump candidacy would do damage to the Republicans in the House and the Senate, and the few governors that are up this time. Move to the Supreme Court. Interestingly enough, Mitch McConnell may rue the day that he decided not to allow President Obama to nominate somebody. One of the people that was under consideration was Brian Sandoval, the Republican governor of Nevada, himself a former federal judge who'd been confirmed unanimously by the United States Senate, including every Republican, because he is a Republican. He was a federal judge. He was a Republican governor. And Mitch McConnell said, no, I won't meet with him and I won't schedule hearings for him, even if he's the nominee. If Hillary Clinton is the next president, which is the more likely scenario at the moment, it will end up not being Brian Sandoval. It will end up being somebody much closer to Elena Kagan and Ruth Bader Ginsburg than to Brian Sandoval. Yeah.
You referred to Trump as nuts.
I did.
Okay.
Forgive me.
I have heard, and I don't know. I have heard analysis that says he's just. He referred to him as nuts, but I have heard analysis that says he's just very smart, and it's showing he knows how to play to the disaffected electorate. And when it comes to being president, this is not his persona, and is not how he will operate. Do you have any comment on that at all?
Well, I don't know him personally. We do not travel in the same circles at all.
You're probably closer to him than I am.
That may be. Well, I know people that know him, and I can just tell you what they've told me. And let me put it this way. Some of the positions that he's articulated are, and this has been clear for a while, some of the positions that are articulated are not consistent with positions he's had in the recent past. Okay, that's certainly true. And is that playing to the Republican audience? I think the answer is yes. Is his manner false in some way? No, I think it is really his manner. It was Now, did the TV show do it to him? Did he did it to the TV show? I don't. But look, you saw the guy on TV for years. This is how he behaved, and whether he adopted it for that and it became who he was, or it's always who he was, that I can't say. But people who've done business with him, for example, that I know, say that is exactly. He is so full of himself, and always has been. They can't imagine like how his head stays on his shoulders today. But he also is somebody who is looks out for number one very clearly, and his road to success, so it's been said to me, has largely been to find ways to make sure that if anything goes wrong, everyone else is left holding the bag and not him. So that's sort of how he's operated. Again, I can't testify to that from my own knowledge because I've never done a deal with him. But I think that to some extent, this is his personality. They're not always his positions. How much he's going to tone it down remains to be seen. I mean, it's worked well for him, and it's very hard to sort of change on a dime here. He is very smart, though. Don't get me wrong. The guy is very smart in terms of being able to assess where the public is. People every week people say, "Oh, well, what he did this week will certainly be the end of him." And when he criticized the Pope, people say, "Oh, okay, now we know that this is the end of him." Well, the reality is, among Super Tuesday Republican voters, he was more popular than the Pope. Okay? So, and it's, when you think about it, it's not that hard to understand. As one person said, I don't really care about the Pope. I'm a Southern Baptist. What do I care about the Pope? That's like, so we rebelled against. So anyway, I don't know if he's going to change very much. We'll have to see. I'm sure he's going to be a little more polished than he has been up till now, but we'll see the tone. Yeah.
Yes. A question. The press in these elections plays a very aggressive role and also takes sides. I'd like to have your view of the press and maybe just a word about that incident with Megyn Kelly of Fox News.
Well, it's interesting. There is press that takes sides, and there's press that doesn't take sides. The cable news channel, obviously, we have one on the right, we have one on the left, and we have one sort of in the center left. And they figured out that's who their audiences are. They play to their audiences in all kinds of ways. The reporters, by and large, I will say I know many of the reporters from all those places, and the reporters really do try and play it straight to the greatest extent possible. I mean, Major Garrett, who was for many, many years the Fox chief political correspondent, is now the White House correspondent for CBS, as mainstream as you get. So the reporters, by and large, play it straight. The hosts on the shows do not play it straight, and the hosts on the shows are stacked. I don't know if anyone ever watched Hannity and Combs on Fox. You get the impression, Hannity's very good. Combs is very bad. They had to look hard to find somebody as bad as Alan Combs to go up against Sean Hannity every day. But they did it on purpose. And then they just got rid of him because he wasn't even that good as a straight man. So in any event, but there's also most of the press, I think, honestly, does their job the way they're supposed to do their job, which is a more or less objective approach. And I think that's certainly true of the print reporters, and it's true of most of the TV reporters as well. But part of their job is to ask tough questions. Hillary Clinton's been asked tough questions. Trump's been asked tough questions. Everybody has. But I will say this. I've been doing this a long time. I've never met a politician on either side of the aisle who believes he or she has been treated fairly by the press. There isn't one. They believe it's all about them, that they're personally out to get me, whoever me happens to be. And at the end of the day, I don't think it's really true. Yeah.
Assuming that he does get elected, what do you know of the people around him who are presumably pretty sharp? Who will he bring in, and how will they run the United States?
This is an excellent question. Earlier I commented, somebody asked me who his vice presidential candidate would be, and I thought the best choice would be his daughter, who he was interested in. It seems to be the only person he really respects, and someone he wanted to date if it was not his daughter. So be that as it may, I don't know. And it is constitutionally acceptable to have your daughter on the ticket. So she'd have to move to her husband's house in New Jersey, though, because you can't be from the same state. But in any event, I don't. It's Chris Christie obviously auditioning for a significant role all of a sudden, having been very hostile towards Trump for most of the campaign, now finds him very acceptable. But other than that, the truth is there are not that many people around him who anybody knows, anybody has had any contact with, anybody wants to raise their hand and say, yes, I'm an advisor to Donald Trump. There just aren't very many of those people. One of them is a guy named Larry Wilkerson, who was the chief of staff to Colin Powell when he was in the State Department. And he's someone who said that Israel was behind the gassing in Syria as a false flag to generate hostility towards Assad. Okay, so this is the level of people that of the person he has around him. But really, no one else has he's not brought people forward, and no one has stepped forward. Contrast that with Hillary Clinton. There's not a person in a think tank in Washington who doesn't claim to be a Hillary Clinton advisor. And she's never met most of them, but they're all busy writing papers about this and that, policy papers about this and that policy on everything from foreign policy to taxation to health care. All of it's being done. Thousands of people, literally thousands of people. There's no evidence that there's anybody doing that with Trump. Yeah.
I wanted to know, is there in principle a difference between the strategy of running for nominee and running for president? Will he get his act together? Will something change? Let's assume that he is a nominee. Will he say, okay, now we're playing the national, this is serious?
Yes. Well, again, excellent question. Richard Nixon very clearly wrote that the way to get the nomination and win the general election in the Republican Party is you have to go to the right in the primaries and then move to the center for the general election. And that's, been the general premise the Republicans have tried to operate under ever since then. Again, it's just not clear because it's not clear. The guy's not clear. In other words, we don't know him well enough. Nobody knows him well enough to know how much of it's a put on, how much of it is just trying to get the nomination, just trying to feed those controversies that have done a great job in getting him the nomination, and how much of it is really him. Again, my sense of it is that a lot of it is really him, and it's going to be difficult to control. If you saw him last night, a number of the commentators were saying, aha, this is the change. This is the new Donald Trump, a little more polished, a little less petulant. But on the other hand, if you saw his performance, it was bizarre. It was no. Yes, you can say it's different from the ones he's had before, perhaps, but it was not. It was different in degree, not in kind. And whether he's really capable of having a persona that is different in kind from the one he has had, very unclear.
Just one more question about the Jewish vote.
Yes.
What are the trends among the Jewish community?
Sure. Well, Jewish community in the United States is overwhelmingly Democratic and has been for years. Will certainly remain so if Donald Trump is the nominee. I think there's little doubt about that. In the primaries, honestly, there haven't been states with large Jewish populations that have voted yet. But all of the hints and suggestions are that Hillary Clinton is doing much better than Bernie Sanders in the Jewish community. Again, there's a long relationship there. There's knowledge, and people don't have that same relationship with Sanders, separate and apart from whatever his Middle East positions are.
Mark, let's take a contrarian view for a minute to the assumption that Trump is going to be the Republican candidate. There seem to be a lot of other variables. If Cruz pulls out, what would be the effect? If Rubio pulls out, if where are the numbers today? How many mandates does Trump need? He needs 1,200 to get. Where are we today on that? I understand that we're quite far from that at this point. So it seems, from what I'm understanding, it's still game. It's still game on the Republican side. Notwithstanding, what I'm understanding is your sense is that it's almost game over.
Well, look, let me be clear. As I tried to say, I think it is not yet game over. I think it is very likely, but it is not certain that Trump will be the nominee. I think it is very likely, but it's not certain that Trump's going to be the nominee. Look, mathematically, it's very far from a done deal. There's no question about it. But the math and the politics aren't necessarily the same, which is to say, well, roll back. Talk about your assumptions. The only way it would seem that people have any chance of beating Trump is if he gets have a one-on-one race. Well, who's that going to be with? Because Rubio won last night. He's going to Florida next. Cruz won last night twice and won once before. He's not going to get out. John Kasich says Ohio's my firewall. He came in second in Vermont, almost beat Trump in Vermont. Very important Republican state. No, I'm just kidding. So it's just not clear that any of these people are getting out. Ben Carson may depart the stage, but the reality is it's very hard to move these people out, and that's one thing that we've seen very clearly in the last couple of weeks. There is no Republican establishment in any meaningful sense of the word. As I said, my first prediction was that Trump would never be viable. My second prediction, also wrong, was that after he won his first primary, the Republican establishment, members of Congress, donors, would all get together and say, okay, Rubio or Cruz or somebody, you're it, everybody else out. Hasn't happened. Hasn't happened because they don't have the tools to do that. They don't have the unity to do that. They don't have the leadership to do that. And so there is no, for all intents and purposes, there is no Republican establishment to make that happen. It depends on the voluntary actions of Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio, and there's no evidence, at least at this moment, that they're sort of going to get out for the greater good. Second, it is not clear that all those votes are going to go to the other person. When Jeb Bush got out, for example, and said, there weren't that many of those votes, but they're all going to go to the anti-Trump or the non-Trump. Well, they didn't. Trump did better on average last night than he had in Iowa or New Hampshire. So it's not clear that those votes have, and better than some of the polls predicted in some states, worse than others, but it's not at all clear that the votes from Rubio or Cruz would go 100% to whoever is left. So there's a lot of ifs in the alternative scenario, which is just why it's not the most likely scenario. Yeah. Oh.
I think there's no doubt that a lot of what's happened, this tremendous chaos, is due to the dissatisfaction with the administration, Obama's administration. People do not feel safer. Many of his decisions have been reprimanded by a lot of the Americans. Hillary is merely a continuation of Obama. How can she be so strong if people are so dissatisfied with what has happened now?
Well, make 2 points. First of all, Democrats are not dissatisfied with what's happened. Democrats are pretty darn satisfied with what's happened. President Obama's approval rating among Democrats is in the 90%. So there is not a lot of Democratic dissatisfaction. There's a lot of Republican dissatisfaction. It's in about the 90%. And then the independents are sort of split down the middle, leaning slightly to the negative side. So, again, from a nomination point of view, she's been hugging Obama even tighter in the last weeks than she did before, because he was so popular is so popular among Democrats. When we get in the general election, she's going to move to the center as well, and she'll, on some key issues, move away from Obama. And she has the reality that enables her to do that, and the record that enables her to do that on some things. So on some foreign policy issues, when she was Secretary of State, it's very clear. It was reported at the time. It's in her book. It's in other people's books. She was in a different place than President Obama on some key foreign policy issues. On some domestic policy issues, she's going to, I think, make a somewhat different case than he did, frankly, because he's the president. What do I mean by that? Obamacare passed. Believe me, there are things in Obamacare that President Obama and most Democrats would like to change. But the reality is they can't open it up because as soon as you open it up, the Republicans are going to try and repeal the whole thing and you have a mess. So if you're the president, you can't actually do it, and talking about it doesn't do you any good. You have to actually try and do it. Hillary, as a candidate, can talk about it. If she gets in and she doesn't have a Democratic Congress, she's not going to do it either, but she's going to talk about it and talk about it as a realistic option. So she, not now, but as we move to the general election, she's going to have fixes to Obamacare. So there will be some differences that emerge on some issues.
But even on her own, Benghazi, all of these things, even in her own history, she has been proven to lie and be deceptive. How does she overcome all this? Do people not see this?
She said she didn't lie.
Yes, she was very clear about her honesty.
Look, she tried not to lie.
This is a debate. We could debate back and forth what's true and what's not true. I will say on Benghazi, just there have been any number of investigations led by Republicans that have exonerated her of any responsibility for anything bad of any kind. So again, these are all issues that will be brought up. Whether it's emails, whether it's Benghazi, whatever it might be, all issues, and the basic integrity attack is going to be one of the key attacks against her. But people are going to look at the other candidate, too. As I said, it will be the first time that a majority of people dislike both candidates. It's great.
Mark, you mentioned the McGovern experience for the Democratic Party in brief, but I want to go back to it a little bit. Soon thereafter, Jeane Kirkpatrick, who was a well-known foreign policy and political scientist, as well as a UN ambassador, wrote a piece for AEI on how the primary system was going to tear down the political parties of America, and she warned that it would be disastrous. Well, maybe it has. Is there any reconsideration of the primaries as they are now? Any type of movement to reform it? Maybe even go back to the smoke-filled rooms, electronic cigarettes.
Yes, vapors or whatever. Certainly not yet. There may be, but it's going to be very difficult. There were reforms that were made on the Democratic side and copied to some extent on the Republican side to try and moderate some of those influences. That's why we have superdelegates. So in the McGovern case, members of Congress, senators, found themselves not delegates of the convention because their candidate didn't win. Now they're essentially automatically all delegates, including party officials and so on. So the party has a much bigger voice than it did in the past. And that's true on the Republican side as well to a lesser extent. But they still have that element as well. But in principle, it's the trend has been towards democratization of the process and towards participation. And it'll be very difficult for a party, for one of the two major parties, to go back and say, okay, we think the public really screwed up here, and we're not going to let you participate. We're going to take it on ourselves to decide who your candidate should be. That's a very difficult position for them to be in.
Follow-up. Is there a possibility of a brokered convention on the Republican side this time around?
Well, it depends on what you mean by brokered. If you mean, is there somebody to do the brokering? The answer is no. If you mean, is it possible that somebody goes to the convention without a majority and has to assemble a majority? That is quite possible. Again, I don't think it's all that likely, but it's quite possible.
By the way, Mark, just Howard Weissman just showed me that Ted Cruz took Alaska. It just came in.
Oh.
Which changes everything.
Changes everything. In Alaska, at least, yes. The Sarah Palin endorsement was not significant enough for Trump.
I'd like to maybe continue Lenny's question. The conclusion to draw from your speech is that American political system is in a very poor shape. That's the right conclusion, I think. I mean, the two candidates are being hated.
What does it say about the American
system? Both countries have not had the possibility to produce good men, positive men, no one acceptable, whatever, you see. Republican Party is completely, how to say, divided and very weak. We saw it. We saw the behavior in front of Obama during the last 3-4 years, especially regarding Iran and other issues in the Middle East. Maybe all that explains also, this is for us very important, the weakening of America in the Middle East, the disengagement, because maybe Obama himself is not the strongest man. He's very intelligent, but very far far away from being strong. He just had not had the right support at the base to do something really strong. You see, so it's a problem for us. I'm not saying America is disintegrating with all the beautiful universities, technology, whatever, the economy, absolutely, but there is something wrong going on in the United States on the level of political system.
Yes, I think we'll be here for a long time yet to come, but there is something problematic. There's no question about it, and it's not a problem that's easily solved. The problem, as I see it, is this polarization that we have that has developed, and that polarization is developed in a way that I think is different than at least some people understand it. It is not the case that people have become more left-wing and more right-wing and less centrist. That's really not the case. What is the case, I was talking about last night, Rick and I, many years ago, were at a seminar in Washington, and together, and we were in high school, and they kept saying over and over again, the big thing you have to know about Washington is there's no permanent friends and there's no permanent enemies. The person who's with you on this legislation, on this bill, could be against you on the next bill, and the guys against you this time could be with you the next time. That was the secret. Those cross-cutting cleavages, those cross-cutting coalitions were the secret to essentially a moderate, productive political system. That has changed dramatically because now, even though they're not wide differences for people, they're deep between people. They're deep differences because what happens is there are permanent enemies and permanent friends, and you do rarely see people crossing the line on any significant issue. So you look across the dividing line, and you see the same people on your side and the same people on the other side every time. And that gulf between them gets deeper and deeper and deeper. And because of that, it is very difficult to cooperate, to get things done. You see that in what McConnell's doing on the Supreme Court. You see it on a whole host of things. You see it in what Democrats did to pass Obamacare. The reality is that has become a very, very deep divide. And there are a lot of reasons for that, but it's a serious problem, and I can't tell you I know how we're going to overcome it.
I would like to add to that, Mark, that maybe there are unintended consequences of getting rid of the program of earmarks, because in the past you could, as leadership on both sides of the floor, you could, in a sense, purchase votes with earmarks, and they've lost this ability to swing votes with it. And
that's absolutely true. It is true also, though, that the divisions sort of predate the end of earmark. So it's not the only cause, but it's a contributor. I mean, there's no way to, as Rick rightly said, there's no way to get people moving. So, yes, we have serious problems. There's no question about it. I don't know what else to say. Yes, ma'am.
So you spoke about what a polarizing figure Trump is, but there's a lot of discussion about how Trump is really how Cruz is really despised by a lot of Republicans, particularly their own colleagues in the Senate.
Mm-hmm. The ones who know him, yeah.
Yeah. So how do you think that if he becomes maybe the only viable option other than Trump, how that's going to play out?
Well, yes. No, I mean, the truth is, Trump went around and saying, even last night when it was no longer true, that he's the only person that's beat Donald Trump. So if you want to beat Trump, Cruz said he's the only person that beat Donald Trump, and if you want to beat Donald Trump, you got to be with him. The problem is that was not a very good message because the people that were most interested in beating Donald Trump also wanted to beat Ted Cruz, and that is the Republican establishment who hates him with a passion. I have no doubt that if Ted Cruz were the nominee, all but 4 or 5 of his Republican colleagues in the Senate would use their secret ballots to vote for Hillary Clinton. He is truly despised by the people who know him because they see him as they see him as dishonest. They see him as a grandstander, a showboater, but they also see him as somebody who puts his own personal interests ahead of everything else and everybody else, and they see him as a demagogue. And all those things and more go together to make him really a despised figure. So, but Lindsey Graham, Senator Lindsey Graham, South Carolina, last night said, you know what? I may have to end up backing Ted Cruz to stop Donald Trump. And you could hear it in his voice and see it sort of in his words. There's nothing he wants less than to have Ted Cruz as his nominee, other than having Donald Trump as his nominee. So it is really, if you take the two worst choices possible, one is slightly better than the other. But again, there's nobody to enforce that. And that's the ultimate problem. Who's going to get Marco Rubio to drop out and let it be a Ted Cruz, Donald Trump race?
So doesn't it mean that Hillary will win the elections?
Not necessarily. As I said, there are things that are happening. Hillary's not that popular a person. You got going for a third-party term. You have an economy that could be much worse by the time we get to the election. So there's lots of things that could happen to make it possible that Trump wins, if it's Trump. But the reality is, as I said, the likeliest outcome is that Hillary Clinton would win that election, but it is not a certainty by any means. Back there.
Yes. First, thank you very much for this illuminating talk. And second, what about WikiLeaks? Hasn't Hillary taken some hits from people who say that she reveals her true direction in the WikiLeaks?
Sidney Blumenthal.
Okay, so Sidney Blumenthal and his son are jerks, as far as I'm concerned. I've known Sidney for many years, but that doesn't matter to like 99.9% of Americans. It's irrelevant. So what? I mean, the reality is it's not relevant from an electoral point of view. It may matter to you, may matter to me in some level, but it doesn't matter to It does not matter in the world of politics. It may matter whether Sidney Blumenthal gets a job or not in the next administration, but it's not going to matter. It doesn't matter beyond that.
So does it matter that the FBI is still conducting an investigation? I mean, it's the FBI. We're not talking about the Peoria Police Department.
Yes.
And I would assume, and I'm asking because I really don't know. I ask myself, because if you listen to Fox every day, you hear something about, it's a matter of days before she's going to jail, and Joe Biden's going to come out and he's going to be the nominee and stuff like that. But, and on the one hand it's Fox, but on the other hand it's the FBI, and they're still doing an investigation. Now you're more of a Washington insider than anyone here. What's the story with what's going on with the FBI, and is it serious?
Yes, it is serious. It's a serious investigation. Is there anything serious underneath it? That's not clear, but it's a serious investigation. However, the FBI does not decide ever whether to indict someone or not. The professional prosecutors at the Justice Department do that. And there is a manual for prosecutors that tells them how they're supposed to behave in situations, various kinds of situations. It doesn't say this, what I'm about to say. It's not in the manual, but you could derive it very clearly from what is written in the manual. To indict the likely nominee, or at a certain point, the certain nominee of a major political party for president going into a presidential election is the most serious thing you can do. And you can't do that with anything short of 100% certitude that you would get a conviction, and even that may not be sufficient, okay? Because the Justice Department would be clearly interfering in that election. And I will tell you that's something they've done to both Democrats and Republicans with negative consequences and serious consequences. The Republican senator from Alaska was indicted by the Justice Department, by the Bush Justice Department, okay? Lost his seat in the United States Senate as a result, and clearly as a result of that indictment. And the Obama Justice Department apologized to him for the behavior of the Bush Justice Department because they said it was mishandled. The whole thing was mishandled, and he should never have been indicted in the first place. Okay, the mayor of Washington, D.C., okay, no, our current mayor, our just immediate past mayor, okay, was the subject of an investigation for 4 years by the Justice Department, a very serious investigation for 4 years. Yeah, okay, that's okay. Let's and there is no question that he lost even the ability to run for re-election for a second term because of that investigation, and no indictment was ever filed. The case was dropped. Okay, terrible. I mean, from my perspective, those are terrible miscarriages of justice, and terrible miscarriages of justice that pollute the political system. And the Justice Department is not going to do that. I mean, having learned some of those lessons, not going to do that in a context of a presidential election, absent 100% certainty of conviction, which is very hard to achieve, and a sense that this is not only something where we will get it, where they would get a conviction, but something that's really, really, really important. And that's another hard case to make. Colin Powell did the same thing. They would have to say, we are going to indict Colin Powell as well, okay, for doing the same thing. They could not just indict. So now, and they would have to indict, what's her name? Not Susan. From Stanford. Condi Rice. Did the same thing. She would have to be indicted. So you'd have to, if you invite Hillary Clinton, you have to invite 2 other former secretaries of state as well. Okay, this is serious business, and the likelihood that all this is going to happen this way, I think, is near zero. So at the end of the day, yes, it's a serious investigation. It's going to lead to an indictment. I think the chances are not zero, but near zero. Yeah.
Nina, you're still waiting?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
After Nina, please.
There seems to me to be, to put it mildly, a lack of questions on foreign policy. Does that mean from the press, from the media, from the TV reporters and so on? Does this mean that your average American doesn't care? And what does that mean for us?
Okay, well, the average American cares but doesn't care, and that's always been the case. So what do I mean by that? When the public is engaged in foreign policy is when the United States is at war. Okay, in a big shooting war, people are dying. Okay, that's when the American public gets engaged, and it's still rarely the most important issue, even when that's happening. So you can point to maybe 2 elections where foreign policy played a really major role. Moreover, what people, to the extent that foreign policy is important, it's not the policy, it's the situation. So there is nobody, I mean, I should say, there aren't 500,000 Americans who could tell you the details of what the foreign policy of the United States is or should be in any one of these circumstances. What the public knows is things are falling apart, and the job of the president is to hold them together. So obviously it's not working. Their policy, honestly, if you ask people sort of the specific questions about should we do this, should we do that, should we do the other thing, they would come out right where Barack Obama is, exactly where Barack Obama is. And they would have no recognition that that's where Obama is, and they have no recognition of the fact that exactly what they're saying ought to be done is being done and isn't working. So that's where we are. The reality is people, what they care about is, does the world look like it's falling apart or being held together? And to many people, it looks like it's falling apart, and they do blame the president for that. And they honestly look at Hillary Clinton as someone who is, and this is, again, independence as well, as someone who is stronger and tougher than President Obama. And that strength and toughness makes them a little more confident that she'll be able to hold it together than that he can hold it together.
What would that mean for us if she gets it?
I don't even want to go there because that's just a fraught subject. But should I start down this road or not?
Well,
my question is really a follow-up to
okay.
Yeah, Nina, it turns out it was a good segue into mine because I want to reverse the focus for a moment. Is there any meaningful role? Oh, okay. I want to reverse the focus if I can for a moment, Mark. First of all, thank you very much for your insightful presentation. Is there a meaningful role for U.S. voters, American voters in Israel, to play, or are we basically bystanders?
Well, no. Is there a meaningful role to play? Yes, you can vote.
Clearly.
And that's very important. I mean, look, we had an election that I don't even know who won, to tell you the truth, between Al Gore and George Bush. And at best, it was a matter of a few hundred votes in one state. So every vote can make a difference, in point of fact. What?
Without voting machines, with punch cards.
Yes, exactly. So every vote can make a difference. Beyond that, is there a role? Discussion and so on is always good, and communicating with your friends and relatives back home is always good. But, are you really going to have a major impact that way? The answer is no. You have a minor impact, but a minor impact can make all the difference in the world. You should keep that in mind. The difference between winning and losing.
A minor impact through voting.
Through a minor impact through influencing how others vote. And even if you're influencing a small number of people, that small number could make the difference.
There may have been an influence in the House of New York, where American Jews here were localized.
Yeah.
So it can happen on the local.
Yes, yeah. I mean, but we're talking about a national presidential election, just not that big a deal.
Israel policy. Can tell us something about Yesh Atid? Whether Lapid will win the election. This is our last question, okay?
Well, other people may have questions, but will Yesh Atid win the election?
Yes, next election.
The next election? Yes.
Yesh Atid, yes. They are now second political party in Israel.
Yes. Yes. Yesh Atid will win. Other questions? Others I can answer that easily?
Seriously, I think Nina's question is important. Do you see any difference or any... What are the realities of the Israel policy of these candidates?
Okay. So let me make a couple points. Not defensively, but let me just explain this a little bit and we'll go from there. First of all, there is a feeling that the Democrats have become less pro-Israel over the years. This is not true, empirically not true. If you look at where the numbers were in 1988, where the numbers are today, you can say the following things about them. First of all, Democrats are more pro-Israel today than they were in 1988. Look at that whole period of time. Yes, true. Okay. People who are define themselves as Democrats. Yeah, okay. More pro-Israel than they were in 1988. In 1988, there was very little difference between Democrats and Republicans. So what you see essentially, I mean, I'm exaggerating here slightly, what you see is a flat line for Democrats and a rising line for Republicans. So what was equal levels of support, more or less, in 1988 has become Democrats staying the same, Republicans becoming almost unanimous. Why is that? One of the reasons is the incorporation of, over that period, the incorporation of the evangelical voters into the Republican Party. They were not part of the Republican Party before. Starting in the early 80s, mid 80s, and onward, they were co-opted into the Republican Party, and that increased the level of pro-Israel sentiment concentrated in the Republican Party. Second, as I said before, leaders influence their followers in very significant ways. I'll digress for a minute to give an example of this that's from an area that's not at all fraught. Okay, so we did a survey for USA Today. We gave half the sample an education plan. Let's just call it Plan A. Said it was the Democratic plan. We gave the other half of the sample another plan, Plan B. We said that was the Republican plan. For the other half of the sample, we just switched the labels. We said Plan B was the Democratic plan and Plan A was the Republican plan. And we said to people, which plan are you for? Well, the substance mattered not at all. The only thing that mattered is when you called it the Democratic plan, the Democrats were for it and the Republicans were against it. And when you called it the Republican plan, vice versa, okay? So there's no question that what leaders say brings a lot of followers, okay? So as Republican leaders became more outspokenly pro-Israel, that brought a lot of people with them. And as the Republicans decided to use it as part of a political strategy to bring the Jewish vote, that too had an impact. I will say, from my perspective, honestly and parenthetically, a very problematic impact. Because for the same reason I just articulated, which is leaders, followers follow leaders, if the African American community, if Democrats in general are hearing from others that Democrats or a Democratic president is anti-Israel, what's their conclusion? I should be anti-Israel too, because that's what we are. So if you tell me that Democrats are anti-Israel, then I guess I am too. So there's some real, making this a partisan issue has some real problems attached to it. But in any event, you've seen a flat line for the Democrats. You've seen an increasing line for the reasons I've explained for the Republicans. In the Republican process, therefore, and particularly, again, when competing for the evangelical vote, Republicans sort of step over themselves to be more pro-Israel than the next guy. That does not happen in the Democratic Party because foreign policy is not such a big issue, and you don't have that same level of competition over the issue. So it would certainly appear from the statements that are made by Republican candidates that they have more invested in a strong Israel, more invested in a strong U.S.-Israel relationship than do Democratic candidates. However, this was also true of George Bush, the father. Okay, and you can say, I mean, you can argue all these points, but the end of the day, for example, on many issues, the behavior was not substantially different from the behavior earlier. So, for example, what's the classic example of this? I'm going to move the embassy. First thing I'm going to do. Okay. So, how many people have said that? How many people have done it? Okay. There is definitely a disjuncture, but at a wider level, if you look at the foreign policy elites in the United States from both parties, the people that are not running for office, but the people that are sitting in the State Department, sitting in the National Security Council, sitting in the Defense Department, sitting in think tanks, if you look at the foreign policy elites in the United States, there is precious little difference between where the Democratic foreign policy elites are and where the Republican foreign policy elites are. So the people who sort of run foreign policy, there's damn little difference between Democrats and Republicans. Elected officials, there's the appearance of difference, but I would argue there's less there than meets the eye. So how does that net out? It's very hard to tell how that nets out with a particular individual, who they're going to listen to, who they're not going to listen to, who the particular people are they gather around them. There is one, there are a couple of members of the foreign policy elite on both sides that are very strongly pro-Israel. So if John Bolton happens to be the Secretary of State, okay, so we'll have one friend in the world. But which would be good for us. They don't think so, apparently. But in any event, I mean, but if you sort of draw from sort of the serious Republicans who deal with foreign policy, there really isn't much difference between Democrats and Republicans. So how it'll all net out, very unclear. But I would not think there's going to be a huge change in approach. Might there be a difference in tone and rhetoric? Yes. Frankly, I think there'll be a difference in tone and rhetoric with any Democrat. Well, with Hillary Clinton, we'll have a different sense of tone and rhetoric than Obama does. But those will be differences in degree, and I think the same thing is true with the Republicans. I think there'll be differences in degree and not fundamental differences in kind.